Hello, my name is Suzi Lombardelli. I am second year faculty at Lord Williams School in Thame in South Oxfordshire. I wanted to start today by saying a massive thank you to the British Nutrition Foundation for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today. This is the first of two sessions. This one is more an introduction to trauma and how to create a trauma supportive classroom, and the second session will focus much more on memory and how we support our young people with memory making and memory recall. So this was the statement that started it all. If I cast my mind back to returning from the second lockdown in March 2021 and coming back into my year 7 group who had been previously bubbly and very, very keen to put their hand up and answer questions and had a lot of knowledge. And I came back to a sea of students who looked visibly scared, very withdrawn, not really wanting to answer questions and volunteer information in the same way. It was almost like they'd forgotten to unmute themselves from a Teams lesson. And I left feeling really quite despondent and quite sad. And I spoke to a colleague and I said, it's almost like they're traumatized. And they said, oh, it's a really big word, Susie. Don't worry, children bounce back. And it got me thinking, do they bounce back? Do we not need to support them with that? And what might that look like? And what resulted was a cavern of research that I unearthed that I certainly was not told in my teacher training, and I think is really valuable and important for teachers to know and be aware of, because it certainly has helped me become a better practitioner. So today we're just going to briefly cover why we're discussing trauma, and I've sort of done that already, and then what trauma is and what might it look like and how do we know and how can we see the signs, and then flipping the script a bit on trauma and what we perceive trauma to be. I think that's really important. And then boulders versus pebbles will become a lot clearer a bit later on. And then the impact it can have on our students, and why we need to know more as teachers, why that's important for food and nutrition, and what do our students need fundamentally, how can we help them. So why? Trauma can have a direct, immediate and potentially overwhelming impact on the ability of a child to learn. Yet this issue has largely been ignored by our education system. And I think when I read that, I thought, right, okay, there's definitely something going on here. And I mean, that was written way before COVID, way before sort of the wave of really big sort of pastoral issues that we're seeing in schools at the moment, and it's been flying under the radar, and I think it's time that actually as teachers we know a bit more about it and we know how to support our students, because I think we can all agree we're certainly not the same adults coming back after COVID, even if it touched you in sort of a minor way or a major way, and if that's the case, then our students are definitely not the same, even though they may appear to be. But I certainly, from experience and speaking to colleagues in other schools, we are struggling at the moment with pastorally with students, and I think this is a bit of a reason why. So what is trauma? I think if we sort of said to each other, okay, what is trauma? We'd go, oh yeah, it's an event, you know, it's something that's quite traumatic and it happens, but what does that actually mean? So it's not actually the event itself, even though that might be, considered a traumatic event. Trauma is the emotional, psychological and physiological residue left over from heightened stress that accompanies experiences of threat, violence and life-challenging events. And if you take those three things, threat, violence and life-challenging events, well, violence potentially not for students, although potentially yes if we consider the pandemic, but threat and life-challenging events are two things that were very apparent, and I think we have been very quick to forget just how concerned, nervous, worried, stressed we all were in that time period, and how that really does change how we feel and how we process information, and how we process our daily life. And life-challenging events I don't think anyone can say that the pandemic for them wasn't a challenge in some way or another. And I think for students, when you look at what students say are a direct impact on their mental health, they say being away from friends and family, feeling socially isolated, loss of routine. Well, we can definitely say that that applies to all homeschooling environments, and schools being closed and not being able to socialise with friends outside your direct family. And I think if we said, you know, what does it look like? I just did a really, really quick Google search on this, and I think these pictures, we go, yeah, that looks about right. You know, we've got parents arguing in the background, some sort of forms of neglect and being around abusive behaviours, which is definitely true. But I think what we have to understand is that a child that is presenting with trauma or struggling with trauma actually can present themselves in a range of ways. This is sort of the more typical sort of things that we think about, but actually they can present as completely in control, because it's the one thing they can control. Being in school is the one thing they can control. They can present as very quiet, they can present as very argumentative, and it really does depend on sort of their sort of family setup and dynamic and how they feel at the time, which is tricky for us as teachers, because is that a child with a trauma response, or are they just extremely quiet? And I think that's the challenge that comes with looking at trauma, and I'll get onto some strategies a bit later on, but it definitely, any child in your classroom will benefit from the strategies put in place for helping students struggling with trauma. We love data, and we love or some of us love data, and we like to know, we like markers of how to know how to handle a situation, and the Felitti et al. Study attempted to do that. So there comes with a caveat that obviously the markers that they decided were markers for adverse childhood experiences. That's what ACE stands for. They said there was 11 of them. They are indicators of trauma. They're not certainties of trauma. That's the first thing. So they're an indication that there might be a traumatic history or a child that is struggling, but they're certainly not a certainty. And also there are other things that actually now, sort of 30 years later, we think actually they should be part of the adverse childhood experiences scale as well. The concerning thing here is that if you look at that bit of data at the bottom, 67% of the UK population thought to experience at least one ACE in 2018. Now, that's enough, but also if you think about the pandemic and the fact that actually there was no form of outlet for families, so there was no going to school, no going around to friends' houses, all of that kind of thing. If you're in a home with household dysfunction, if you're in a home with abuse, it's going to make it more likely, and it's going to make it more sort of compacted and with no sort of outlet for that. So you know, if you think about the stress and the other concerns that was going on at that time, then actually yes, the pandemic has made those ACEs more likely to occur. But as I said, it is not a certainty, it is an indication, and I definitely believe that this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a starting point, and it is the only scale that we do have. Why this is important is because it has a very direct reaction. So health-wise, and this was then Hughes et al. Who worked with WHO in 2017 and analysed the data of over about 250,000 participants of 37 separate ACEs studies. They were all based on the original study. So this is a really big pool of data, and it just shows the increase in likelihood. So if you had 4 or more of these ACEs versus no ACEs, how much more likely you are to adopt potentially lifestyle choices, or seek support in places that might not be
most beneficial, and then it does sort of make these things become more likely. So if you're looking at nearly 4.5 times more likely to have to struggle with depression, nearly 4 times more likely to struggle with anxiety, obesity, teenage pregnancy, drug use, suicide attempts, like that's really big, high stakes things that we're suddenly massively more likely to be vulnerable to, I think is probably a better way of putting it, than before. And what is concerning is that while that list is quite hard hitting, and you can go, well, you know, no, there was no physical abuse in the home, so you know this, you know, that they're quite black and white, cut and dry, sort of this is what I would consider a traumatic event to be. However, when you look at trauma in more detail, and I sort of look at it as big T and little t trauma, actually the simple trauma, the bigger traumas, so things that have a shorter duration, so something like a car accident, a house fire, it's a one-off event. There's very little blame on that child. There's a lot of support around that child, because we understand that it is a very difficult time. We do this with adults as well. So, for example, I suffered a bereavement recently, and the support that I had around that time was fundamental, and I couldn't have survived or coped without it. However, the complex traumas, the ones that go under the radar for longer and longer, the smaller ones, the living with things for prolonged amounts of time, the sense of blame on the child, the sense of dismissal as well, and we'll come to dismissal a bit later on when talking to students in particular. And also, the earlier that happens, the deeper tracks of damage that it can cause. So if you're thinking about the pandemic, the younger that happens, so when we're into sort of primary ages, the bigger the effect is going to be. And there is really clear data and research that says that younger students will struggle with regulation, and they'll struggle with memory, and that's sort of where the second part of this comes in. But because it happened younger, because they have less habits, they have less life skills, they have less life experiences to secure onto, and you know, the constant dismissal of, but that's a small thing, but you know, that's not really, don't worry about that, you know, that little support means that actually smaller, more continued traumatic events, ones that probably you might think as a one-off probably aren't a big deal, actually can have significant, if not more of an impact on a child than a simple one-off event. And the way I sort of explain this to people is boulders versus pebbles. So if you saw a child struggling with a really, really, really heavy boulder, you would not think twice to go to that child and offer them some support. Maybe take it from them, maybe help them carry it, but you would not think twice in doing that. However, if you saw a child with a rucksack on their back and they had their hands full, and you asked them to open it, and you just saw a group of pebbles in their hand, you'd go, oh, it's just some pebbles. But actually, when you take that rucksack off and realise that the rucksack is also full of pebbles, because they just keep putting these little chips on their back the whole time, it's the same weight, but it's less significant because it's a pebble. So actually, that's my analogy for simple versus complex trauma, is that it's the same weight. It's a child struggling. It's just progressively gone over time, and we haven't really thought, oh, they might need help with that pebble today, because it's a smaller amount. So that's just something to sort of help kind of build a picture of simple versus complex trauma, and what that might actually, the impact that might actually have for children. So why do we need to know more as teachers? So, okay, it can affect their health and their lifestyle choices, and we know that. It has a direct impact on their education though. So, and this was from Trauma Informed Schools UK. I was quite startled when I saw this data. So no ACEs, 97% of children have no learning difficulties or behavioural issues. 3 or more races, 3 times as likely to experience academic failure, 5 times as likely to have attendance problems, 6 times as likely to have behavioural problems. 4 races or more, over 50% had learning needs, and 32 times more likely to have behavioural problems. It increases quite dramatically from that point on. And then if you think about that, the pandemic has not only made ACEs more likely, but when I was talking to Trauma Informed Schools UK and I said, do you think the pandemic will become its own ACE in itself? And they said, absolutely, without question. They believed that the pandemic would be its own ACE in the future and categorised as such. So if you think about that, a child with 1 or 2 now has 3. A child with 3 now has 4. And it's not to say that they'll suddenly, they'll suddenly have a recognised learning need, but what that's saying is that that impact is more likely to make things like regulation and accessing learning harder. And that, I think, is why teachers really need to know about trauma and what to do. So why is this important for us? So it's really important to understand some of the markers for trauma. Children are likely to be hypervigilant. They're likely to be concerned with their own safety and the safety of those around them. They may be purposefully difficult or reactive. So in terms of there's a lot of research that says that, when they're used to adults letting them down, or when they're used to adults dismissing them, they will look for that again to perpetuate that cycle. So the child that picks an argument with you for no real reason, oh, pick up that tea towel off the floor for me, please. Why? That sudden defiance, and I think we can see that a lot. I know that we're struggling quite a lot with defiance, and just remaining calm and not getting into that cycle is super, super important. The other thing that also is likely is re-traumatization. So something that may trigger their sense of hypervigilance or their sense of being concerned with safety. They may not come in and suddenly be hypervigilant, but something may happen during the school day or during your lesson that may trigger that. And if suddenly a child is asking a lot more questions about the hob, for example, or is suddenly reluctant to use the oven where they've always been fine, actually that might be a form of, okay, I need to keep myself safe and I don't want to touch anything that's gonna hurt me. They're gonna struggle to communicate that, though. They're not going to be able to say, well, this happened 4 weeks ago and I'm really struggling with this and this is why I don't want to touch the oven. They just know that actually the oven is unsafe, or using the grill because they can see the element, they don't like it. And also, I think any child that you would speak to as a teacher, if you said, well, why didn't you answer that question? You knew the answer. And they go, well, I didn't want to get it wrong. We know that children don't like taking risks when it comes to learning. We really push them to go, no, no question is silly, and we really want you to learn and don't worry about getting it wrong. But that worrying about getting it wrong thing in the back of their minds the whole time, if they're hypervigilant and concerned with being safe, taking a risk to answer a question that they might get wrong is a threat to their safety. And that sounds really insignificant, but that's a really big issue. And I think especially when children are nervous or anxious, that can be amplified. So I think that also then sort of keys us into how we approach questioning in the classroom. I think that's a really big thing, and the support that goes in place for that. And I will come and talk about that in our second session on the 13th of June. So in terms of what our students need, so we are not replacing counsellors. I'm not here to say that our job is suddenly to diagnose trauma, diagnose what the issue is, help that child through it, and become that person. We are a teacher. We are very good at our job, but our job is not a counsellor, and to say that we are is belittling both us as a teacher and the medical profession as well. That's not what I'm suggesting we do in the slightest. But trauma-informed practice is not about making huge changes to classroom practice. Actually, you look at some of this list and go, well, I do that already, which is brilliant. But now you've got another reason to do it as well. It supports all learners as well. So sort of like a lot of our SEND practices, this really helps all learners too. And like I said, it's not about we're not suddenly becoming investigators going, oh, you know, this, that and the other. By all means, if you are concerned about a student, flag them the way that you should, speak to your safeguarding leads, get them some support. But I'm not for a minute suggesting that that support is you. What I'm saying is it's about doing some really simple things in our classroom. Now, we're big on health and safety and food, we know that. So we just need to make sure that that's really explicit. So why are we doing these things? Why are we keeping you safe? We're doing these things to keep you safe. This is my role in the classroom. You can ask me these questions. You can come to me at this time. You can come and find me and we can talk about this. Don't hesitate to do that. You might want to find different methods of doing that. So they can email you, for example, or they can write you a note in their book, or they can come and talk to you, or they can pass you a note. Like, be quiet, because children, as we know, aren't the best, and quite rightly sometimes we can be a bit scary coming up and talking to us about something that they feel quite concerned about. So give them a range of ways that they can contact you for that support. It's really super important that you have really clear routines in your classroom, and I know that there's a lot of buzz, especially at the beginning of this year, about making learning exciting and making it engaging and all that kind of thing, and absolutely 100% we need to do that. But let's not forget that actually for a lot of our students, routine is absolutely paramountly important for them. They need to predict you need to be predictable. So by all means have that amazing engaging lesson. All of our lessons, I hope, and we all hope, will be that way. But routines are so important for all students, especially in times of uncertainty, especially when we're getting back to giving them really, really good habits, especially if you think about Key Stage 3. They've had a really, really, really dysregulated sort of sequence of learning over the last few years. Routine is important. Creating an environment of respect is really key as well, and establishing yourself as a safe individual, someone they can come and talk to. You might want to sort of think about some self-calming techniques that they could potentially use. That might be something that you can do. So I use some regulation techniques with my year 7s. They would come in and I would say, right, draw me a picture, colour me something in, or tell me something about your day. And that was the first thing we did. And actually everyone came in much, much calmer. The classes were settled so quickly, and actually we could really, then I could go and check up on the ones that I knew might have struggled with homework, etc., rather than going straight into the lesson. Instructions in order, so really predictable, super clear language. Planning for error, so children, and I will come to this when we when on the 13th, when we talk more about memory, but they might not necessarily remember. They might not necessarily remember in the right order, which is why instructions in order is really clear, and your language being really clear is so important. But plan for that. Have some time to go, oh, actually, you don't remember it. And why don't you? Instead of saying, why don't you remember it? You're in the lesson. It might not be that they were in the headspace to learn. So planning for error within your schemes of work and within your lessons is really important. Giving students choice is also really important. Sometimes that's not possible, but maybe in a homework, for example, if you're doing a recipe that they can adapt it in a certain way, they might not necessarily take the choice, but giving them that choice, it makes them feel more in control, makes them feel more like they are a person. They've got autonomy in that classroom and they can make decisions for themselves rather than us making all of the decisions for them. And that's super, super important. The one I've left to talk to you about is high expectations. I left that till last because I think actually a lot of the time we go, oh, well, okay, well, we know what's going on. We can excuse that behaviour, or we can excuse it. Actually, no, we can't do that. That is the one thing that they need us to have high expectations of them. They need us to have the same expectations as everybody else, because that is how they sort of get back to, okay, this is what's expected of me. So continuing those high expectations in your lessons is really important, and being consistent. And when I talk about being consistent, I mean for the positive and the negative. So if you're going to say you're going to do something, you need to make sure that you're following through and doing that, whether that's positive or negative. And that is on to my top tips. So give students a choice wherever possible, not only academically, but when discussing other areas of school, like such as sanctions and rewards. So for example, before I did this research, I'd just sort of say, okay, this is what we need to do. And actually now what I say when I talk to a student about their behaviour is I say, right, okay, we've got a choice. We can continue down this path and we can go through the warnings and this is what's going to happen, or I'm going to come back to you in 2 minutes and you're going to tell me what you need, what you think you need, and then I can help you. And actually the difference in the conversations that I have with students now, and it'll be things I never even knew they needed help with. And I wouldn't have known, you know, oh miss, I can't actually remember how to sieve flour. Well, that's fine, we can do that together. But giving them that opportunity to say what they need is really important. And rewards, you know, we do positive phone calls home and positive postcards, and a lot of the time I will actually say, okay, now I will say, which one do you want? Do you want a positive phone call home or do you want a positive postcard? Do you want me to call mum? Which adult at home would you like me to call? And I think giving them that choice of who that praise goes to is really important. As I said, smaller consistent traumas, the complex traumas, often have more damaging effects than the one-off larger life-changing events due to the support offered to a child. So they may not recognise that their behaviours are linked to their trauma, and they may provoke adults to let them down, like I was saying earlier. They're depending on you to follow through. So if they have reached that warning 2 and they need lunchtime, they need a lunchtime detention, and that is really important that is logged and put on the system and followed through. It's also super important that if they're in a hypervigilant state, it is going to affect a child's memory, and more about that on the 13th. So it's important that the instructions are delivered in a variety of ways and readily available to students. So again, sort of our dual coding, making sure that our verbal instructions are also mirrored on the board, or our verbal instructions are also mirrored by a worksheet. So they've got more than one method of finding that information, because if they were worrying about the fact that they haven't got food ingredients when you were giving them the first set of instructions through the door, they're not going to have taken any of that in, because they're going to be too worried about talking to you about the fact that they don't have their food ingredients, for example. That's especially important when you're talking through health and safety, and where, you know, they may place them at further risk. So getting them to answer you back in a whole class setting, or having those health and safety risks on the table, something like that is really important. But I think the biggest thing is to acknowledge their concern. So before, I would always think that it would be a really good positive thing to say, oh, don't worry that you haven't got your food ingredients, don't worry about that, it's fine. But actually what you're saying to that child by saying don't worry is you were silly to worry about it, you shouldn't be worried about it, it's not something you need to be worried about. However, that child has probably been worried since they got up this morning that they don't have their food ingredients. So saying to them instead, thank you for telling me, I understand that might have been quite difficult, let's find a solution together. Basically what you're saying is what you would have said anyway, is what you meant, isn't it? It's we'll work it out, don't worry. But actually you're saying that without telling them that what they were worrying about wasn't relevant. So just think through the language that you're using and try to just switch it from dismissive to affirmative. And that I've seen students visibly, their shoulders visibly go down as soon as I said, thank you for telling me. I understand that was hard to come and tell me that. Let's find a solution. And I've seen the change in just their demeanour. So it is really small things, but that can really help a child to feel much more supported in the classroom.
So just a final thought from me is that we cannot solve this for students, and we cannot take their experiences away for them, but we absolutely can support them and just try and take some of those pebbles off of their back and help them to do that. Thank you very much for listening, and please do email me if you have any questions or want to talk further about anything that I've spoken about today. I'd love to hear from you. Really looking forward to the second part of all of this work that I've been doing, which is really looking at how we support students with memory making and memory recall in the classroom. So I hope you'll join me for that section too. And I hope this has been a really useful presentation for you, and something that you feel can really help support your practice. Looking forward to seeing you in the second session. Thank you for your time.